The topic I've taken today is one that suggested itself to me. I originally actually was using as a title Discerning Design, some historical reflections. This will be a largely historical talk. But then I decided to use the title Theologies of Nature instead. But in the back of your mind, you might keep the notion of design, since that issue of design and how one discerns design has been very central to much of the recent debate about Darwin, about evolution, particularly in the United States, of course, and the whole question about what one means by design and how one goes about discerning it is a very crucial issue. But it occurred to me that it might be helpful as background for that discussion to look at some of the theologies of nature, some of the classic theologies of nature of the past. And so what I'm proposing to do this morning is to do a rather rapid survey. It'll be, unfortunately, I think, a bit superficial, especially for some people here who know the field. But I think it's useful to see the wide variety of ways in which, down through the ages in the Western, and I'm speaking simply of the Western tradition today. I'm not going to look, we don't have time to look at the Islamic tradition, which has a lot to say about this, indeed. But in the Western tradition, there is a wide variety of views of what one might call the theology of nature. What I mean by that is simply the relationship that is perceived to exist between God, or in some sense, God, that I'll come back to that point later, and the nature that we see around us. What is the relationship? What is the distinctive view here of God and nature, the relationship between them? Now, one fairly obvious place to start, especially with this group, one very obvious way to start is with the Old Testament, where nature is celebrated over and over again in lyrical terms. If one looks at some of the great works, the great lyrical works of the Old Testament, at Isaiah, at Job, but most particularly at the Psalms, one finds, as I say, a lyrical approach to nature, an enjoyment of nature, reveling in nature, you might say, but always seeing nature as the making of the same God who had seen them out of Egypt. The linking then of a covenant with God, with Yahweh, and the work of nature itself. Nature around God, nature around the people who write and who read, nature itself is of God's making. And what's very striking is there is no question of proving God's existence or anything of that kind, of course. The Israelite tradition was not particularly philosophical, but there was no need for that. There was this long tradition of a guardian who had been with them from the beginning, who had seen them out of the desert, who had seen them across the Red Sea, and who finally has seen them into the Promised Land, has overcome their enemies. But that same God was not just a tribal God, was not just a God as the God of the Canaanites, for example, or of the Philistines. This was a God of all peoples, incidentally, which unfortunately the resonances of that were not perhaps as fully explored as they might have been, but certainly the God of all nature. I think here of Psalm 103, I'll just read a few lines from Psalm 103, one of the most familiar, just a few lines. Addressing Yahweh, it says, "You founded the earth on its base to stand from age to age. You wrapped it with ocean like a cloak. The waters stood higher than the mountains. At your threat they took flight. At the voice of your thunder they fled. They rose over the mountains and flowed down to the place which you had appointed. You set limits that they might not pass, lest they return to envelop the earth. You made springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow in between the hills. They give drink to all the beasts of the field. The wild asses quench their thirst. On their banks dwell the birds of heaven. From the branches they sing their song. Lord God, how great you are." Now, what's evident from that passage, and indeed one could quote many others like it, is that this God is responsible for the making of all of this, not just for protecting a single tribe, but for making the universe itself, and in particular for protecting it against dangers, for protecting it against the waters that could envelop it. The waters have been driven back. I think the Israelites, even the early peoples, were aware of fossils in the hills, and I suspect that that might be a reference here, that the waters had at one time covered the hills. Certainly the Greeks knew that very well. And so here we have the suggestion that this God protects the animal world. It gives drinks to the beasts of the field, protects the animal world and gives it sustenance. That is the same God that has seen them through so many dangers. So this God then is a very personal God, but a personal God who has responsibility for the making of the universe itself. Now, one point that is worth noting, because it has come in for a lot of discussion in later times, there's no suggestion here of what later came to be called creation ex nihilo. That is something I think most Scripture scholars, perhaps not all, but most Scripture scholars would agree today that that is simply not an issue in the Old Testament. The making here, the issue as to what they were made from, so to speak, is simply not, it's a philosophic issue that I suspect the people of Israel did not really worry much about. At any rate, there's only a single explicit reference in the Old Testament, very late in the Old Testament, in the book of Maccabees, to a making from nothing, and even that one, Scripture scholars tend to think should not be given much weight. The whole idea of a making from nothing is a rather alien notion in itself, and the idea of the God as making it, the first phrases of the book of Genesis might suggest that, but in fact the translation given today would suggest that there was a wilderness of waters there to begin with. So at any rate, the kind of making that we have in mind here then is simply a fashioning from whatever there was, a waste, a void, whatever it happened, whatever word one wants to give it. But this is simply not explicit. It's not a matter that was debated one way or the other. The importance of that we'll see again in a moment. So here we have one first vision. I'm going to go through six different possible ways that one finds in these early times, and all very different. Now, to contrast with that, the usual contrast of Athens and Jerusalem is if we cross the Mediterranean to the Greek world, the issue of God there was rather central right from the beginning. There were a number of ancient Greek religions, but they had nothing like a creator, nothing like a maker of the Jewish sort, and certainly no long tradition of a protector god or anything of that kind. I mean, the gods of Olympus were of a very different sort. But what we do find among the philosophers of Greece, the philosophers who approached the whole issue in a very different way was to look at the world and ask a question of what we would call today a philosophic sort: how did it all come to be? And in fact, that issue, how did it all come to be, is the oldest of Greek philosophical questions. The pre-Socratics already are asking, out of what did the world come? And the suggestion was that there was a single kind, a single stuff, if you like, came to be called matter much later, a single stuff from which the stuff might be water, for example, as with Thales. The stuff might be of any kind, but there was a stuff from which things were fashioned. Again, no hint of creation ex nihilo, of course. And the idea was then that one could discern from the world, by looking at the world, that there had to have been a fashioner of some sort, a fashioning, not so much a fashioner as a fashioning of one or other kind, but without any suggestion of a personal being behind it of the sort that we find in Israel. Now, one reaction against that view, or one very different reading of it, came from the atomists, who supposed an eternal or a near eternal universe where things had come together from simple corpuscles or atoms, atoms as they were called, meaning indivisibles, and that these had come together in a simply chance way over the ages, had combined in complicated ways to make the world that we know, so that there would be no question then of any fashioning of any sort, of any deliberate, any purpose of fashioning. The idea being a reaction, of course. The atomist approach was in some ways a quite deliberate refusal to accept any kind of religious interpretation of the original making. But I'm not going to pause on those. There's much that could be said about those early views. I want to focus on the two classical Greek views from our point of view. And these are to have an enormous influence in later ages, both of them in different ways. The first of them, of course, is Plato. Now, I'll read first, well, let me say first, Plato looked at the universe around him as we might say a philosopher would today, and what he saw was a world that was intelligible. Intelligibility for him was the first mark of the universe around. The intelligibility was somewhat limited. I'll come back to that point, but first of all, there is an intelligibility there, and the kind of intelligibility in particular for him is linked with mathematics, as it had been for Pythagoras. There is a kind of mathematical form that often is realized in the world, and it leads him to the notion of form, which becomes the dominant notion for Plato, that there are forms that are intelligible. And he makes an interesting move here that has much resonance today. I think we might hear about it later this week from John Polkinghorne, because he assumes that if something is intelligible of itself, it not only is the object of mind, but it is the creation of mind, the making of mind. Mind has made it. There is an interesting kind of move here that if something is open to the mind, it can only be such if it is itself the product of mind. And so mind becomes a quite central actor in this story for him. And the forms that are realized in the world, in the first instance mathematical forms, but then biological forms, the form of each kind of thing, for example, these forms are realized, and he has to ask then, how are they realized? Now, the great work, he wrote one of his most important works, the Timaeus, celebrates this whole problem and speaks of the word here, demiurgos, the Greek word demiurge, can be translated as a craft worker of some kind. It's unfashionable today to use the term craftsman. I suppose I could say craftsperson, but let's say craft worker. And so the craft worker here, the demiurge, has fashioned the universe, imparting form in a way that we can see. And so I just read a short passage here from the Timaeus. Taking thought, therefore, the demiurge found that among the things that are by nature visible, no work that is without intelligence will ever be better than one that has intelligence. And moreover, that intelligence cannot be present in anything apart from soul. In virtue of this reasoning, when he framed the universe, he fashioned reason within soul and fashioned soul within body, to the end that the work he accomplished might be by nature as excellent and as perfect as possible. This then is how we must say that according to the likely story, that this world came to be by the God's providence, in very truth a living creature with soul and reason. Now that passage from the Timaeus contains the whole story really of the Timaeus. It contains a great deal. And a few of the things that it conveys, I want to underline. The first is that there is this craftsworker, who in fact has managed to impart form on the world around us. And this form is good. It is the work of intelligence. It's good. Something without intelligence lacks that kind of goodness. But the universe has been framed in the light of the forms, and it's as perfect as possible in that light. And he relates that intelligibility to soul. There is somehow a soul. He suggests in the Timaeus that there is not only the imparting of human souls, but the imparting of a soul of the universe itself. That's a complicated issue that I leave aside as to what exactly he means by that. But I come now to perhaps the most crucial part in terms of the later issues. Because as Plato looked at his world, it was clear to him that it was in many ways imperfect. The world of sense is changing. Forms don't change for him. Forms are unchanging. To change is to fall away from the perfection of the form itself. To change is to lack fullness, to lack the fullness of the form. And so change itself becomes problematic. But in particular, one has to see that the world of the senses is a changing, corruptible world, which obviously is different from the world of the form. So how did all that happen? Plato's answer was to have a great resonance in later years, because Plato supposes that when the demiurge imparts form to the world, he imparts it on a receptacle, is the best word we can use here. Aristotle would use the term matter, but Plato uses the notion of a receptacle. It almost is something like space. The demiurge imparts it on a space, on a receptacle. But what's absolutely crucial is the receptacle is not of the God's making. The receptacle is something independent. There's no sense here of it itself as being of the God's making. And what's worse, in a sense, from the demiurge's point of view, it's resistant. It is something which resists form, which is shifting. He has various metaphors here. It's a kind of a shifting, it's like a shifting surface of water that sort of changes every moment. It's a shifting thing upon which form cannot be fully realized. So that the stuff of the universe, or the receptacle, if you like, of the universe, is such that it simply doesn't accept form fully. And so Plato has an immediate explanation of the imperfections of the world, the problem of evil, as we might call it today. The whole problem of defect, the problem of falling away from perfection, is solved by Plato by supposing that there is an original source of resistance in the world itself, an original source which simply doesn't lend itself to the making of perfection. And so there is a suggestion then of a kind of struggle here between an original, between the demiurge, the craftsperson who seeks perfection, and a stuff or a receptacle which is simply incapable of accepting it fully. And so the sense world itself, from the point of view of our theory, of the theory of knowledge, which I'm not going to talk about, the sense world itself is, to use the famous metaphor, it's like images on the wall of a cave. We have to discover the forms by simply looking at images. We don't have direct, except through mathematics, we don't have direct access to the forms themselves. We have to do the best we can with the sense world, but the sense world is a very defective reflection of the world of form. And that becomes a very powerful theory of knowledge. But that's not the side of Plato I want to emphasize. So we have then in Plato, there is a god, a demiurge. He usually doesn't use the term God. He uses it in one or two passages. But the notion of its being a personal God of the Jewish sort, the idea of its being a protector, someone who cares about humankind, there's no suggestion of that. There's no suggestion of a personal relationship. It's in him. You can think of the demiurge, if you like, as because of the notion of a crafts worker as in some sense a person, but the idea of a relationship with the people of earth, that is lacking. The philosopher here is simply looking at what he regards as a philosophical problem about the making of the world and about the way in which it might have come to be in the first place. Now, by contrast with the Platonic, and a very strong contrast with the Platonic, was the work of Plato's student. It's extraordinary to see, in a way, something that one doesn't so often find. One sometimes does, of course, but so strong a divergence between teacher and pupil as between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was, of course, a student of Plato's in the first place, but he certainly diverged very strongly from his master on a great many things, and not least upon this issue here. Aristotle, to begin by the contrast in this way, Aristotle also has the notion of form. He takes over the notion of form from Plato. But unlike the Platonic forms, Aristotle's forms are at home in the world. Each form is in a nature of some kind, and it's fully in that nature. There's nothing defective about it. Each form is fully realized. If you have a sea urchin or a tree, because he usually speaks in terms of living things, he was a great biologist, the form of that living kind, and by extension, non-living kinds, he would include them, although they're for him of less interest. He is not thinking in mathematical terms as Plato did. He's looking at the kinds of things in the living world most especially, and seeing each of them as fully realizing some kind of a form. There is a form of the sea urchin, a form of the elephant, and so on. There is a form which is realized, and it's realized in nature by the activity of that nature. So by contrast with Plato, change for Aristotle, by quite the contrary, is not a sign of corruption or something like that. It's not a sign of falling away. Change is, in fact, the activity of nature. Nature shows itself by a particular form of acting. There is a particular activity that is characteristic. And so he develops a notion of nature, and he sees each form as inhabiting a matter. Now, the Aristotelian notion of matter is extremely complex, and we can talk about it in the discussion. I have to leave aside all too many issues like that, I'm afraid, but we can at least see some of them in discussion. The matter here has many roles. It has the role of individuating the form. It has the role of situating the form within a complex of other forms. And for Aristotle, there can be defect, but the way in which defect or chance occurs, he uses the term chance in this context, the way in which it occurs is because each form is qualified by the environment. The environment means that the acorn can be eaten by a pig instead of growing into an oak tree. Because the acorn is not sitting out by itself in some ideal world, the acorn is part of a larger world, and that larger world can defeat the purposes of the acorn. So what happens here is that the environment, the material environment within which the form is realized, the nature is realized, itself can be the subject, can be the source of defeat, the source of qualification, the source, as Aristotle says, of chance. Now, at the center of Aristotle's natural science, of his physics then, is the notion of nature. And Aristotle has a curious, to our mind, a rather curious central principle in physics. It's very different from later physics in this sense, because for him, at the center of his physics is the notion of motion, of change, or specifically of motion. And for him, the central principle in understanding motion is this, that whatever is in motion is moved by something other than itself. Now, on the face of it, that seems very unpromising. for example, for living things. So it's a curious principle, and it will have a long, complicated later history, ending in defeat at the hands of Descartes and other 17th century writers, notably Newton, because in fact it is not motion that requires explanation, as Newton will be the first to really clearly see. It is rather change of motion, or as he called it, acceleration. But at any rate, the later history need not concern us here. What we're concerned with is a notion of movement which requires a constant source of the motion. If there is something in motion, like the stars, for example, in the sky, there has to be a cause which is keeping them in motion. Now, as he traces that principle upwards, it means that each motion on Earth has to have a further cause, and he tends to trace it outwards to the world of the planets, the world of the fixed stars, and finally to a single mover, the first mover, who is responsible for all this motion, who is responsible for the, as it were, the motions as they stream downwards, as you might say, from the first mover, from the spheres down to the sublunary realm of Earth. Now, it's a very complex view, and it obviously leaves him with a lot of difficult problems, as he was well aware. But what's crucial here is that the only way in which a God appears in this scheme of nature is as a source of motion, not a source of form, but a source of motion. There would be no movement, there would be no change without a first mover. But that first mover once goes on in his metaphysics to argue that it must be pure act, it is something immaterial, something spiritual, but it is responsible for generating, it is a necessary being that in some sense generates motion. Now, that's important for our story here, because it means that Aristotle's God has a rather limited kind of relationship with nature. Not only is there no personal relationship or anything of that kind, but it is simply responsible for a single feature of the world, and not the formal feature, but the motion. As far as the forms themselves are concerned, or the natures, if you like, to use a more Aristotelian phrase, the natures themselves that play the role of Plato's forms here, those natures themselves are unchanging. Not in the sense, I mean, obviously nature, the individuals come and go and die, but the natures have a kind of eternity about them. And so Aristotle argues for the eternity of his universe, of the universe he's looking at. So it becomes a typical feature, and at later ages a much debated feature of the Aristotelian universe. The reason Aristotle makes it eternal is, I think, this. At the center of Aristotle's universe is the notion of natures that fit well together, that each of them act for the good of that nature. And there's a kind of a cosmic order and an order around each nature, a cosmic order that is always safeguarded. When stones, for example, are taken from their natural place, they tend to return to it. If you lift them up, they tend to fall back to their natural place. There is, in terms of non-living things, there is a natural place for everything to which they tend to return. And the same, in a sense, with regard to living things, they tend to act for the good of that kind. And so we talk in terms of teleology here. The word teleology, as you know, means comes from the term telos, the Greek term telos, meaning I have to be careful here. It has two meanings. In Aristotle's case, it means an end. It means an end towards which the nature tends. It doesn't mean a purpose. Aristotle has no suggestion that teleology involves conscious purpose. That's a constant error that's made even by modern scientists who talk about Aristotle. I've read a lot of biologists who talk nonsense about Aristotle as, supposing that purpose was involved in the Aristotelian universe. It wasn't. What we have here is a seeking towards an end, not a conscious seeking, except in the case of conscious beings, of course, but in the case of something like a stone, for example, a stone will act naturally to restore order, to restore the place of stones. And living things, and Aristotle categorized more than 500 different species, more than any biologist since probably. He argues that each of them is fitted for the world in which they live. There is a sense of means to end here in the Aristotelian notion of telos. Each kind of thing, each animal is fitted for the kind of world in which it is. The birds lay their eggs at the right time, and all of that familiar story that will be developed so much in later years by other thinkers. But Aristotle already has quite a bit to say about that, about the different kinds of beings and the way in which both their structures and especially their behaviors, their instinctive behaviors, serve the purposes of that kind. Not necessarily that individual, but that kind of individual. And so there is a kind of end relatedness, a teleology, which doesn't entail any kind of purpose of action, conscious purpose of action on the part of these things, but rather a kind of an automatic or a natural seeking after the end of that creature. Now, that's the relationship with nature for Aristotle, but you can see here that it is very different from Plato's, and of course extremely different from the God of Israel. Now, let me go on to the early Christian view, which is interestingly, of course, quite different. If one looks at the early church here, at the very first theologians, as we would call them today, of the early church in the late first or particularly early to middle second century, the theologians of that time, what we would call the Christian theologians, as they were coming to be called, were faced with a problem, a central problem, intellectual problem for them was this. They were coping with a Greek world in terms of which Greek philosophy or Greek philosophies, the many different Greek philosophies, were part of the educational structure of that time. The educated person in the Mediterranean world knew Greek philosophy. He knew particularly his Plato. He knew knew something of the Aristotelian tradition, but in particular he was concerned with philosophical issues. And so the Christians had to face philosophic questions right from the beginning. There are many difficult, extremely difficult philosophic issues that the Christians had to face, notably notions like the Incarnation and the Trinity. But not only them, the question was, who is their God? I mean, how do we understand that God? Now, when they faced this issue, the most sympathetic Greek voice they could find was Plato, not surprisingly. And there were many Neoplatonic, modified Platonic views developing at that point. And so Neoplatonism became the most common resort of the early Christians, apart from a simple refusal to think of the Greek philosophies, to say we have our scriptures and that's enough for us. And that was a fairly common early Christian response, that the scriptures of themselves give us all that we need. Anything more than that is de trop. And so we have here a multiple set of reactions, but more and more as time went on in the second century, there was a realization that simply the Greek philosophies could not be set aside, but that not only that one could make use of them. And the Neoplatonic was the one that first suggested itself. Now, if one takes up the Neoplatonic scheme as a Christian, as an early Christian, there is an immediate problem, because it's clear from what I said about Plato that Plato's world is one within which the original matter is not of God's making. The demiurge doesn't make the matter of the world. The demiurge is faced with it. It's the best he can do, so to speak, but it's not of his making. And so the question of how the notion of the Jewish notion of creation was to be understood becomes gradually apparent. Now, there are some early Christians, Justin Martyr, for example, who are happy with the Neoplatonic view and will simply say, well, there is a matter here, but God works with this matter, makes the mountains, the stars, and the living things, and so on, from the matter that's there. But the problem with that, there are two problems with that. The first is that it means that God is not the God of everything. And there was a tendency within the Jewish tradition to see God as all-sufficient and to make explicit something that had not been explicit in the Old Testament, namely that God is the God of all. And to look at the book of Genesis in particular and to see God as by his word bringing things into existence, not by shaping and not by making, not by modeling clay like a craftsman, but rather by simply saying, let it be. And it is. And so there is a development, a reaction, if you like, beginning to develop against a Neoplatonic view, which would seem to qualify, to limit the power, the creative power of God. And so a gradual coming to realization of what we call today creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Now, that phrase, creation from nothing, of course, is an awkward, it easily can be misunderstood as though God takes nothing and sort of does something with it. It means creation ex nihilo means creation without any materials, without any prior materials. It isn't a creation from something else. It's a let it be, an act of will on God's part. At least that's the way the Christians will interpret it. So there's a gradual development as the second century develops until we come to Origen, for example, a great early Christian thinker whom we heard about yesterday. And Origen is very clear that for a Christian there's no dallying with Neoplatonism in that sense, that God is the creator of all that is in the full ex nihilo sense. Origen and Theophilus of Antioch is a colleague who also develops that, but Origen is often seen to be the first very clear holder of what we would call today creation ex nihilo. Now, it's interesting that at the same time in the Jewish tradition at that time, people like Philo, for example, whom we heard about yesterday, they do not, in that Jewish tradition, it does not move in that direction. Interestingly enough, there's no commitment in that early Jewish, non-Christian Jewish discussion of the first centuries. There doesn't seem to be a move in the same ex nihilo direction. Well, that's another story. Now, I want to move on here to an absolutely crucial figure, and I have a very special reason for this group in particular. I want to jump ahead across a couple of centuries, across the developments that followed people like for example, like Origen, Justin Martyr, and others, and the Greek fathers, particularly Gregory of Nyssa, who's very important here. I want to jump immediately to Augustine, and I have a special reason for that, because Augustine has an absolutely remarkable account of creation that was unique up to that, but there's nothing like it before Augustine. And to be truthful, there's not much like it since, until modern times, in some ways. And it's one that Charles Darwin would have loved. I'll come back to that. Augustine, I'll have to say a little bit about Augustine here to explain what happens. Augustine was born in North Africa, as you know, he was an African. And when he grew up, his mother, the famous Monica, was a Christian, but he himself grew up in an environment that tended to be dominated by what we now call the Manichaean view. Manes had been a Persian, Iranian, a Persian philosopher of the previous century, and had developed, well, to use a cliche of today, a Star Wars type cosmology. A cosmology where good and evil are fighting with one another. It's a not uncommon early view in many of the myths of the ancient world. But at any rate, Manes developed this in a highly philosophic way, and with a rather extravagant account of the struggles between the powers of darkness and the powers of light, without developing the Manichaean view in great detail. There is this suggestion then of the world as being a place of struggle where good and evil are in balance, and the evil can often overcome. The good has to fight against it. It's a place of struggle. There are forces of darkness, there are archons of darkness who are struggling against the forces of light. It's a view that unfortunately describes our present world all too well. But at any rate, so we have this Manichaean view, which was at that time in North Africa very popular. And you can see why in a world where the Roman Empire is collapsing around in Augustine's own lifetime, it collapses in his much beloved North Africa. And so the Roman securities that had lasted for centuries are collapsing all around, and the darkness is closing in. You can see the attraction of Manichaeism in that world. Now, Augustine himself was Manichaean for a time, but he ultimately reacts against it. He goes to Milan, comes in contact with St. Ambrose, and there's a long story of how he finds his way back to the Christian church. If you read the Confessions of Augustine, one of the great documents of the early church, you'll see the story told in very personal terms there. But for our purposes here, what's important is this. The Manichaeans had a different account, naturally, of origins, a completely different account of origins. And for that reason, they regarded the book of Genesis, the first 2 chapters of Genesis, as nonsense. I mean, the Christian account of a God who makes everything and sees that it's good. I mean, remember in Genesis, and God saw that it was good. Okay, that's exactly what the Manichaeans don't want. And so they mock the book of Genesis. And they point out, for example, the sun, after all, is created only on the 4th day, so how on earth can there be days before you have the sun? I mean, they make the usual charges that were made at that time and have been made sometime since. At any rate, they saw Genesis making no sense. Now, Augustine saw, as a budding Christian philosopher and theologian, that he had to face the Manichaean challenge. And so he attempts a commentary on Genesis that was not satisfactory to his own mind. He did finish it. He then started a second time, and again he couldn't finish it. He left it on, the first one he did finish, but the second he left incomplete. But finally, in the year 401, he started what was proved to be one of his greatest works, the De Genesi ad Litteram. We heard about it yesterday, on the literal meaning of Genesis. We saw that the notion of literal has to be broadly interpreted in this context. Now, what I want to focus on is one feature in particular here, or well, 2 features. First of all, he regards the 7-day story as clearly metaphorical. He argues that it simply cannot be taken literally in our sense of literal. It's literal for him in the sense of the intention of the author. This is a confusing point of the use of the word literal here. But it is certainly not literal in the modern sense of that term. It's a metaphorical construction, and as a matter of fact, I won't go into how he ultimately explains that 6 number, because it has to do with the angelic knowledge. It's a rather peculiar theory he has here. But the crucial point is this. What he argues, and here he's very much influenced by Stoic philosophy and by the Neoplatonic tradition, the tradition of Plotinus, a later development from Neoplatonism. So he's highly influenced by the Greek traditions of his own day. But what he comes up with is really very striking, because what he wants to argue is that what happens is that God creates the universe in a single instant of making, and within that instant are the seeds of all that will come later. The seed of every living kind are contained in the first act of making. The seeds, he calls them these rationi seminales. It's hard to get a good translation of the Latin here. It's actually a Stoic phrase originally. It means rational seeds, or I call them seed-like principles. They're like seeds, they act like seeds. Now, he argues further that time itself, about which he has much to say in the Confessions and very eloquent, time itself is a feature of the universe. It's a created entity. It doesn't exist apart from the universe. He has that wonderful little story of the man who asks, what was God doing before he made the universe? And Augustine half seriously gives the answer: he was making hell for people who asked the wrong questions. That story indicates for him that there isn't a time before the universe. Time is a feature of the universe. It's part of the, just as Einstein would say today, space-time is, in fact, the universe. It's a part of the universe. There's no sense in asking temporal questions about God. No sense. I mean, what's God doing, or what was happening before that, or even the notion of foreknowledge. That would lead us in another direction. God does not have any foreknowledge. God only has knowledge. Now, you'll hear a different story. John Polkinghorne wouldn't agree with me there. But at any rate, from the Augustinian standpoint, time itself is the first creature, and it's the creature of the universe itself. But what's critical here, and particularly critical for the notion of evolution, is the fact that from Augustine's standpoint, there is no sense in supposing that God, as it were, makes something and then successively has to patch it. God makes it all sufficient from the beginning to do all that it has to do. The notion of creation for him, of a transcendent creator, would be, I think, diminished by a universe within which later patching has to be done. You pop in a mosquito here and an elephant there, and let them go. I mean, that's not Augustine's kind of universe. The universe is all sufficient. And what he says is each seed will mature when the conditions of soil and water, of earth and water, are right, which is interesting. When the environmental conditions are right, that seed will appear at some point in the undisclosed future. He doesn't say anything about how long that might take. Now, he realizes that that kind of making, that kind of growing, of that seed-like work here is very unfamiliar. He says it's not like ordinary seeds. And he says if we try to understand how that seed could develop, he says we simply don't know how it could develop. But then he says we don't even know how ordinary kind of seeds develop. How does an acorn become an oak? We don't know. We don't have that kind of knowledge. And he does say, in a way which is kind of prophetic, that there would be a kind of knowledge there, but we simply don't have it. Well, the modern scientist would say that perhaps we do. So, at any rate, that notion of creation, that notion of a creator who makes a universe which is all sufficient from the beginning. Now, there is one big exception for Augustine. He is, after all, a Platonist in many respects. The human soul is not of that. The human soul still requires the special relationship of the creator. He worries about the human body and sort of goes around and round about that. But he is inclined to think that somehow the human body can come from the resources of earth and water too, although he's not, he leaves that a matter of debate, actually. But you can see here a different notion of creation, a notion which has many resonances for us today. Let me just say, I don't have enough time to develop this further, but let me just say that when Darwin wrote his work in 1859, the great Catholic English writer, biologist, St. George Mivart, who was a colleague or a contemporary of Darwin's, and who accepted the theory of evolution but did not like Darwin's version. He and Darwin had a notable falling out, and Mivart himself had a falling out with the church later on that many of you know about. But Mivart was the first that I can find who recovered Augustine, who was the first to point out that Augustine had in fact given, as you might say, a precedent for an evolutionary universe. Augustine was not an evolutionist because each seed becomes its own kind. There's no transformism. There's no transformism of one kind into another. But the idea of a potential which is there from the beginning is certainly Augustinian. I can't spend any more time at that. Now, time is short. Let me go on. I have two more quick stories to tell. I wanted to develop the one on Augustine because it's the least known. Now, let me move to Aquinas, the other great thinker of the early Christian church. And Aquinas was, of course, an Aristotelian. It's interesting to see what Aquinas makes of this, because what he actually does is he reports on the Augustinian story. He's familiar with it. I mean, the De Genesis Litterum was a fairly popular work in the Middle Ages. It dropped out of sight later on because it has rather, how would I say, extraordinary features in some respects, some other parts of it. But at any rate, it was well known, and so he does do it justice. But he obviously has problems with it. And you can see, in a sense, why he would have as an Aristotelian. I mean, Augustine's view is about as non-Aristotelian as you want. It's not an eternal universe, and it is a universe within which natures can come to be. And in particular, it's a form of growth or making that is not in the least like anything like we know. An Aristotelian would find that very hard to accept. It was much easier for Aquinas to say simply to stick with the Genesis story and suppose a miraculous making of each kind. That's one way, if you're an Aristotelian, to simply cut the cord and say, well, we have miracles. I mean, Aristotle plus miracles will do the job. But Augustine didn't need that. Okay, now what Aquinas has is an interesting variation, however, on Aristotle. I'll have to content myself with one point here. When he asks about God's relationship with the world, perhaps the most significant place to look is at the famous 5 ways, and in particular at the 5th way. The 5th way, supposedly to prove or to rationalize the existence of God. I'll read the 5th way here. The 5th way, and by the way, this translation, you might be interested to hear, is the Gilby translation, which was done a couple of doors up here, a couple of doors from St. Edmund's at Blackfriars. Thomas Gilby did this translation. The 5th way is based on the guidedness of nature. An orderness of actions to an end is observed in all bodies obeying natural laws, even when they lack awareness, stones, for example. For their behavior hardly ever varies and will practically always turn out well. They will practically, this is Aristotle now, they will practically always turn out well. They're regular, one point. Secondly, they nearly always turn out well, which shows that they truly tend to a goal, but remember, not a conscious goal, a goal in the sense of good for that nature. And do not merely hit that goal by accident. Nothing, however, that lacks awareness tends to a goal except under the direction of someone with awareness and with understanding. The arrow, for example, requires an archer. Everything in nature, therefore, is directed to a goal by someone with intelligence, and that someone we call God. Now, very briefly, what Aquinas is doing is asking a question as an Aristotelian. He's taking over the Aristotelian framework, but he's asking a question that Aristotle simply doesn't ask, and saying, well, yeah, the universe is tending in the way you say, all of that teleological tending towards order, regularity, and order which is for the good. But why? How does it come to be that way? He asks the existential question. What's characteristic of the 5 ways and of Aquinas generally is he puts an existential question to Greek philosophy. Why should it be? That's not the Greek question. The Greek question does not ask why should it be in the first place. Why should there be a thing of that kind? What he's saying is, look, we have in fact a rather complicated universe here within which things act regularly, and they also act regularly for the good of their own kind. Now, how could they come to be that way? I mean, they just, to simply say they've always, see, Aristotle finesses that by saying, well, they've always been that way. But Aquinas says that's not an answer. You have to ask why there should be natures of that kind in the first place. Why should there be that? And it has to be the work of intelligence. Why? And he gives an answer that Darwin would appreciate. Why? Because in fact there is a guidedness going on here, and that guidedness could only be due to to mind, basically to a creator. Okay, so that's a distinctively Thomistic answer. And finally, in just a couple of minutes left of me here, finally, if we jump here to the, as we've already done yesterday to some extent, if we jump here to the 17th century and to people like Boyle and Ray and the others we heard about yesterday, then we have a different story. And what happens, to be very brief, is this. Descartes, at the beginning of the 17th century, in one sense, returns to an atomistic view. He calls it corpuscular because by that time the notion of atom had fallen out of favor. An atom means indivisible, and most of the natural philosophers will say we don't know if they're indivisible. We can't prove that. So let's not call them atomos, indivisible. Let's call them corpuscles. So Descartes has corpuscles, and he supposes a God who, in the first instance, brings to be corpuscles and motion, nothing else. Corpuscles, motion. That's all that Descartes provides. Now, Descartes has a long reason for that, but at any rate, what he has here is only two things, matter and motion, and matter is considered as corpuscular. And Descartes, in the Discourse on Method and at more length in the Principles of Philosophy, as we heard yesterday, Descartes has a most extraordinary suggestion to make, extraordinary for his world, his Christian world. He goes back to the ancient atomists and says, if you have a world of corpuscles in motion, they will gradually form more and more complex bodies. Stars will form, planets will form, ultimately metals will form on Earth and so on, and finally living things will form, and ultimately we could have something like the human body. Like Augustine, he of course accepts the human soul. He leaves that aside. But he supposes that the resources of matter in motion are sufficient, in fact, to bring about the kind of world we know. Now, the reaction on the part of Christian thinkers to that was vivid and negative, as you might imagine. Although there were many Christians sympathetic to Descartes on that issue, it was such an enormous leap of faith, you might say, into the faith in the resources. It was not Augustine's notion of potentialities of seeds, but rather just corpuscles. It's a highly reductive view, and the corpuscles themselves have only a single property, and this doomed the system. Cartesianism fell by this. The only property of the corpuscles is their volume, which is hopeless. I mean, any idiot knows, and even in Descartes' time, knows that you can have corpuscles of the same volume with different mechanical properties, different densities. He had no density. He did not have the property of density, which meant that Cartesian mechanics didn't have a chance right from the beginning. But at any rate, that's another story. So at any rate, that's his resources. But notice what he says is our world can come to be, including all of this endedness, this directedness, all of it can come to be by simply mechanical action of corpuscles. Now, what happened in reaction to that, and notably in England, was to say, well, you might be right about planets and stars and things like that, but it simply can't be right about the living world. It simply can't be right about the living world. And the reason is, as Ray in particular will lay out in beautiful detail, in the same words that Darwin will later use, actually, in some cases, is that there is a peculiar relationship of means to end in the animal and plant world, particularly the animal world, that the structures of the animal world, and in particular the behaviors of the animal world, are oriented to the good of that creature. And how could that kind of adjustment of ends to means can only be the product of intelligence. It can only be the product of intelligence. And so the animal world simply can't come to be by a random kind of chance action. It can only come to be by the interposition of intelligence. Now, this became what came to be called the natural theology of the 17th century. And notice that what we have here is quite interesting, because what Boyle and Ray in particular are able to do is to construct an account of the living world. We would call it a biology. They don't use that term. But they construct a biology which terminates, and terminates persuasively, in the claim of a maker. the claim of a maker who makes the living world, because only a maker can, as it were, terminate. Only a maker can incorporate purpose in that sense. Purpose only not in the conscious sense, but in the sense of adaptiveness of means. Only a maker can do that. That's a perfectly good argument. So that in a funny sense, and an odd sense from our point of view, the science of biology, using a modern phrase, of course, not a 17th century phrase, the science of biology in the 17th century terminates, just as Aristotle's had terminated in a first mover. The biology of the 17th century terminates in a first designer, someone who designed the living world. That's what biology leads you to. And that, of course, is the story that Darwin did so much to undermine. Okay, I'll stop at that.
Well, thank you, Ernan. I'm sure you'll be delighted to take questions.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely tremendous overview of the whole field. But I think there was a slight skipping over. You went from the Old Testament and then through Plato and Aristotle and then to the Church Fathers.
Yes.
But bypassing the New Testament. And do you think there's creatio ex nihilo in the New Testament, in the great Christological passages, for example, John's Gospel?
I don't think that there is any strong New Testament argument in favor of creation ex nihilo. I mean, let me be careful with what I'm saying here is, the Bible generally, Old and New Testaments, are claiming the presence in history, in the history of the Jewish people and later in Christ. They're claiming the presence of a maker, but they're simply not specific as to what that entails. They're not specific as about the Greek question, and they simply don't. It's not that they deny creation ex nihilo. It's not that they insist that there is a prior stuff. It's just that the issue doesn't interest them, or it hasn't occurred to them. The reason it occurs to them when it does occur in the 2nd century is because they had to face the challenge of a Neoplatonism which sees matter as the source of evil. Oh, by the way, there is one other factor in that story I left out, an important factor. Another influence that begins to show itself in the 2nd century, particularly towards the end of the 2nd century, is Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism was a bit like Manichaeism. It is a fight of good and evil. There are these evil forces acting against, and the Gnostic world also is one in which the good God has no full power over the world. And if you take the most extreme of the more or less Gnostics, Marcion, he insists that the God of the Old Testament is an evil God. Look at all the terrible things he did. And so there are essentially two gods. The God of the Old Testament becomes a force almost of evil. And so that's an extreme form. So they're forced to make a choice that the earlier ones did not make. But that's not to say that, so to speak, what the Christian theologians of the 2nd and later centuries were doing was to draw out what they see to be the implications of that earlier complete dependence on God. And they see that as entailing the notion of creation ex nihilo. Now, let me just say one more thing. The price of that is very high, and the Greek philosophers knew that very well. If you take the Christian view, you do something that no Greek ever did, none of the early Greeks, or would have done, which is to make God responsible for everything. You look at our world, well, Plato says defect is everywhere. You look at our world, and the many other Greek philosophers will say, you can't think of it as a perfect world. So you see, it's a brave, courageous act to say that our God, and Augustine is the one who faces that fully and realizes what later generations will call the problem of evil, because he knows that you have two huge problems here. One is human freedom, which gives him so much trouble. If you make God the creator of all, including human action, I mean, what do you make of sin? And the other is, of course, the evil of the world around, natural evil and so on. And so the price is high of the Christian option here. creation ex nihilo has a very high price, one that we still pay today. In a sense, we still face that issue.
Yes. Just before we go on, can I just press you on the John passage that Rodney was referring to? You know that Jesus made all things.
Yes.
Without him, nothing was made that was made.
Yeah.
Are you saying that they interpreted the term "made" as fashioned rather than as created?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's the question of what you mean of making, and what's consistent with the Old Testament, New Testament, is a fashioning. It's not committed to that. You can reinterpret it afterwards as making from nothing if you want. But I mean, the origin of the term itself and of the notion itself is the making of a craftsman, of a craftsworker.
He is before all things in Colossians 15?
Yes, before all other things. I mean, that doesn't mean before all things has to be. That's a phrase that would, in fact, strongly suggest that it's ex nihilo, I suppose. But as to whether that definitely commits explicitly to ex nihilo, I think most the scripture scholars, they don't seem to be convinced of that. One could debate it. Now, let me just say that there are people who will still argue that there are sufficient traces, like the mother of the Maccabees, to take the most famous phrase, the mother of the Maccabees whose sons are being killed gradually before her eyes. In the case of one of them, will describe God as the God who made everything from nothing. I mean, she uses that phrase. But even there, people claim that it's not clear that she, after all, there's a question whether the mother of the Maccabees was a theological authority or not.
Great Howard.
That was a very enjoyable summary. I'd like to ask your opinion, if you have one, on just what Descartes was doing in the work that you mentioned. At least one place he claims that he believes fully in special creation of a mature world, and this is the Christian belief and what the church teaches and so on. I know some people think he wasn't lying there, and some people think he was just maybe saying that to cover his neck in the context of the condemnation of Galileo in the 1630s
Right.
and so on. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah.
Or would you point me to someone?
Yeah, I do have a view. I mean, anyone who reads that passage will have a view. What Brian is asking here is what Descartes meant by the qualification he puts carefully into that discussion in the Discourse on Method, and again into the discourse into the Principles of Philosophy. He talks about this world, the world I described of corpuscles who gradually, through their emotions, begin to form complexes, just like the ancient atomists had said. And he goes into it in detail, but one interesting feature of it is he does say that there is another possibility, which is that God simply made things the way they are now. And this is a possibility, and he seems to say that, of course, might be the preferable one. But there's two points to make about that. Descartes was working in an environment where, in his original Paris and even in his exile in Holland, where the theological orthodoxies were very strong. The Sorbonne was a place ready to sanction and even to punish departures from orthodoxy. And Descartes was not exactly a courageous adventurer in the realm of ideas. I mean, when it came to taking personal risks, he certainly was not psychologically in that direction at all. By the way, I would recommend a beautiful new biography of Descartes by Desmond Clark, which came out just a few weeks ago. I think it's from Cambridge, as far as I remember. And I had read it prior to publication, and it's the best. Well, I think I can't really say it's the best in the sense of having read all the others, but it's a absolutely splendid biography of Descartes, who's a very complex figure. but Clark has done a wonderful job in recovering. This episode, by the way, Brian, is covered very fully in Clark's book. But at any rate, I think, you ask what my own view is. I think it seems to me clear that Descartes is putting that in as a kind of, how would I say, protective disclaimer, like the author who says at the beginning of a book where he's clearly writing about X, that any resemblance to any living figure is completely accidental, but we don't believe a word of it. So he puts in this reference to the conventional Christian view of a separate making day by day, but he presents his own account then so vividly and so persuasively that you can see that from his own personal point of view, I think he thinks that that really is preferable, that really accounts for things in a naturalistic way that gives it precedence from his point of view over the more conventional story of a miraculous making over a period of days. So even though he leaves the reader with the choice between the two, I would think myself that the way he presents it, it's a bit like Galileo presenting the two sides. You don't have any doubt when you read the dialogue on two chief world systems as to which of the world systems he's opting for. That was why Urban got so upset with him. There was no question which he was. And so when he very implausibly in the trial later on says, well, I really was, I wasn't really presenting it very favorably. Well, you only have to read a few paragraphs to see that that's not right. And I think the same is true of Descartes. That would be my own view, at least, anyway. I think that was simply a careful, prudential disclaimer just to keep himself out of trouble with the authorities in Paris.
Yes, Lydia.
Just a technical question on Aristotle. You said that all motion needs a mover. I thought that only violent motion would need a mover.
No.
So a stone returning to its natural place needs an explanation as well?
No. That's actually, violent motion, of course, needs a mover. No, the curious thing is that even in the case of natural motion, say, take, for example, for him, the dominant, the most interesting natural motions are the motions of the planets. And they require a constant source of motion. Something has to keep them in motion. See, if you think of it in modern terms, think of it this way. From Newton onwards, we think of change of motion. Any change in motion requires there to be a cause of that. What Newton defines as, what he means by the term force is something that brings about a change in motion, a change in the motion itself. Now, Aristotle apparently thought, and gives reasons indeed for thinking, that motion is going, even natural motion is going from potency to act, and that requires itself a cause. Now, he has real trouble there with living things. It's not clear that he has a consistent notion of how living motion is brought about. He has to suppose there, in fact, something like a soul, which in fact is regarded as the mover, as though it's different from the thing itself. He has quite a problem with that. But he very definitely supposes that anything that moves, even a natural motion, requires there to be something that brings that motion about. So even natural motion, therefore, needs a mover. And as I say, in the case of living things, the motion, the mover can, he's never very clear on this, but the mover could in fact be a soul or something of that kind, which is intrinsic to the body, but it's something other than the body itself.
Thanks. Just while that microphone's going along, a thought that struck me is that every single philosopher you've mentioned has required some outside agency to make their system complete.
Yes.
Is that generically, is that true of nearly all philosophers through the work?
No. As a matter of fact, I suppose I should have taken care of that. There are quite a number of philosophers. Well, let me begin with Plato, for example, whom I did discuss. It's not entirely clear, and Platonic scholars will discuss whether or not the demiurge, the crafts worker, might not be intrinsic to the universe itself. It's an open question, and the major Cornford, for example, and major Plato scholars will say that it's an open question whether or not you should interpret the demiurge as a completely outside agency, or as something which is immanent to the world itself. And what might lead one in that direction is that he has much to say about what he calls the world's soul. So there is an immanent principle of action, of motion in the world, namely soul, which is the soul of the world. He sees the movement of the world itself as requiring something like a soul to account for its motion, and Aristotle, of course, will have something a bit like that. But you could interpret the Plato story as having not an external transcendent agent, but rather an agent who is internal. But usually Plato was interpreted the other way, dominantly, and not least because of the Christian tradition, I think. One other very important story I didn't say anything about is the Stoic account. And the Stoic account is resolutely immanent. I mean, the God of the Stoics, if you can speak of a God in the Stoic case, is like a fire. The Stoics use the metaphor of a fire which is intrinsic to the world itself. So that's an open question.
I was fascinated by your description of Augustine's view of an instantaneous creation containing the rational seeds of all that would follow. But if I expound a similar view to my friends in terms of modern physics, they accuse me of deism, of God setting the world going and leaving it to run. Could you comment on the relationship between?
Yes, well, see, that's when I expounded this view once, a colleague of mine at Notre Dame, whom some people here know well, accused me of being a semi-deist, and that's nearly as bad as being a deist. The semi doesn't do much good there. No, Augustine, you see, is quite clear about something. And this is the only way in which you can, if you like, rescue that kind of view from deism. It's to insist on something that the deists did not insist on, which is the constant need for God to hold the universe in being. It's not simply a matter of creation understood as origination, but creation understood as conservation. So the notion of conservation is absolutely central to Augustine. See, the universe is itself a time-bound being. For Augustine, time is a mark of imperfection. We have lost our past. We have not yet got our future. We have only a fragile hold on the present. And so our temporality is clearly a mark of defect. For Augustine, it's simply unthinkable that the creator, the transcendent creator, could be marked with that kind of imperfection. Now, some modern Christians, John Polkinghorne will be hearing from, does in fact take the step of saying God is temporal. But basically, Augustine will say you cannot suppose that God is temporal, because that is simply to impart or to impose on the creator the main defect of the creature, namely that slender hold on being, which is the presentness is all we have. We don't have a past, we don't have a future. Okay, now from that point of view, it means that God's relationship to the world is a single, it's not an act of creation that happened a long time ago alone. It's an act of bringing to be, in a timeless way, a universe in which you have to understand from our perspective that includes both creation and conservation together. And so at every moment, at this very moment, God is holding us on being. From Augustine's point of view, God is holding, and it's just as much a creation as the original act. It's not, the deist thinks that the creation is something that happened many, many years ago. From Augustine's point of view, creation is something that's going on right now, except we call it conservation.
I've seen it twice written, that the sum total of all energy in the universe is zero. I can't remember the first reference, but the second one was by Peter Atkins, who perhaps wouldn't be the best friend
I'd have
of
to
this
come
organisation.
closer. I'm a bit hard of hearing.
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
yes. I can repeat it. Anyway.
I've seen it written twice, that the sum total of energy in the universe is 0. I can't remember the first reference, but the second reference was it was written by Peter Atkins, who as I say, I don't think would be one of the best friends of this institute. But if it is true, it gives some substance and new meaning to the idea of creation ex nihilo, and also a role for God in maintaining creation, because something's got to stop all the energy, positive and negative energy, cancelling itself out.
Well, I can
But-
see why Peter Atkins.
Ernan, can you
might
come back
like-
to the...
I can see why Peter Atkins might like the view that the sum of energy is nothing, but that view itself, I think. I mean, from the point of view of contemporary physics, I'm not so sure about that. I really think that's Peter Atkins doesn't like what he regards as a speculative character of religion. I would regard that as more speculative than the incarnation. I mean, let me give just one reason for that. Physics at the moment is an area of increasing darkness. The whole idea of physics as advancing into the light has to be set aside. Darkness is increasing. It's 96% at the moment, and it could increase even further. Dark energy and dark matter. Now, darkness here means we don't understand what they are. So, as physics has advanced in the last 50 years, the darkness has kept increasing leaps by bounds. And since we don't know what dark energy is, we don't even know that there is a dark energy. As a matter of fact, we don't know that. I mean, there are other ways in which dark energy could be understood. One could jiggle various laws of physics, the laws of relativity, right, Brian? This is Brian's area. You could, in fact, take care of that in different ways. So the whole idea of making a flat claim that the energies of the universe cancel out, so to speak, or even that you can make any serious attempt to calculate what the energy of the universe is. I mean, I don't think that amounts to anything. No, I think that, you see, what's happening in modern times is curious, I think, from that point of view, because, I mean, to be very quick about it, in the 17th century, Descartes started a move that proved fateful, I think, because he takes the ancient concept of matter, the Aristotelian concept of matter, and he forces it into a framework which says matter is nothing other than, and he says volume, basically. Now, that turns out to not work. Then its matter is nothing other than volume and density. Okay, that doesn't work. Then Newton comes along with a non-mechanical view, at least as it was described originally, because he brings in this weird stuff called gravity, which doesn't fit at all. It's a mysterious. I mean, Newton hasn't a clue how it works. I mean, because it's action at a distance, and as he says himself, that's nonsense. So, I mean, Newton has a real problem with gravity himself, more than most of his colleagues had, as a matter of fact. So I mean, what you have here is an increasingly problematic character of the material element itself. And when we get to quantum theory, I mean, it gets really problematic. So that the whole idea, let me just end by putting it this way, the whole notion of materialism, I think, has to be looked at very hard, because materialism seems to presuppose that we know what matter is. Now, the 17th century thought they knew. They thought they could give a definition in terms of a small number of what they call primary properties. We know that doesn't work. I mean, dark energy is as good an idea of that as you could come up with. And so the whole idea of, if we say that something is nothing but material, or if we call ourselves materialists, the first question to ask is, well, what do you mean by matter? I mean, do you think you understand what matter is? Well, for heaven's sake, that's ridiculous.
I thought all matter...
Yeah,
Sorry. Could I just come back?
just quickly, because there's one more question, one more comment as asked.
I thought all matter was energy. So
Yes.
we were Now, I don't know what energy is.
Yes.
But I thought we could dismiss matter as being energy.
Shall we come back to this in the discussion this evening?
Well, no, matter and energy can be transformed into one another, but they're not equivalent. I mean, I'd rather be made of mass than made of energy.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Brian, did you want to make a quick comment? If not, we'll take...
Yeah.
You do. Why don't you come up to the front and
Do
just
we
make
have
it as
the-
quicker? Just use this. And then, just come stand to the front.
Yeah, right.
And then we'll have the last question, and then we'll have a coffee break.
I just wanted to make a comment about the question of whether the total energy of the universe is zero or not. I did a literature review of sorts about 2 years ago on that. There are a number of ways of calculating it. And, the paper where I talk about this is on the web. It's kind of a standard result in general relativity. Basically, if the matter of the universe is has the same density everywhere, which is the standard old hot Big Bang sort of story, then you usually do wind up with a total energy of zero. If you were to believe, which most people don't, that the matter eventually stopped, then you would presumably get a positive energy. So Atkins' claim is, as far as generalistic mathematics is concerned, is a pretty reasonable one. But there is still the issue, on the one hand, of local conservation, not just global conservation. And it's far from clear that a point that seems plausible at the level of global conservation is still plausible with local. And second, one, of course, has to think about quantum mechanics, and what to say about quantum mechanics is always hard. So I won't try.
Thank you, Brian. Let's take the last question.
Benjamin Weicker, a Catholic theologian from the U.S., he traces Darwinism back to Epicurus and Lucretius. Do you think that's a viable assessment? He traces Darwinian evolution back to the ideas of Epicurus.
The Epicurean.
And Epicure himself, and also Lucretius in ancient Rome. And well, since Epicure wanted a God-proof universe because of his hedonism, it was a way of kicking out of the creator from the site. And from that on, Lucretius in Rome got the idea, and he was the first one to speak about actually natural selection. And then, according to Benjamin Weicker, that idea moved into the modern world, and Darwinism is just a manifestation of that. That's a theory, but I wonder how would you come to terms with that.
Could you get back to the microphone?
Well,
Thank you.
the whole idea of where an idea comes from is always difficult. If you have a very general idea, an idea like evolution, or an idea like matter, an idea like mass, whatever, ideas like that have multiple parentage. And it's true. I mean, if you want to look at a promising place in the ancient world, the conventional place to look is not to the Epicureans, but long before that to Empedocles, because Empedocles was actually the first. Now the Epicureans tend to pick it up a little bit, but the Empedocles in the Greek, an early Greek pre-Socratic, does suggest the following. It's a sort of modified atomism that clusters of what we would call organs of living things come together to form living bodies, and only some of them are fit to survive. There are random collections of what you might call parts, living parts. Now, where they come from, no discussion of that. They're somehow there. But what happens, according to Empedocles, is you have all of these different living bits of living things, livers and hearts and lungs and God knows what, and they come together, but only few of them are fit to survive. And those are the ones that become the parents, the ancestors, the progenitors of later generations. Now that idea, of course, has overtones of natural selection, but it's simply lacking. When Aristotle discusses that, which he does in some detail, he simply points out, I mean, the obvious thing, where are you going to get those living parts from? I mean, that's simply unexplained and rather implausible. So there are elements of that, but you see, one crucial thing is this, that if you look at people like Empedocles, or again, especially at the Epicureans, they simply don't have a creator. It's a way of bypassing the notion of a creator to say, well, it could all come to be in a natural way. What Augustine is saying, you see, is saying, yes, you're right, it does come to be in a natural way, but you have to ask why that kind of natural way would exist in the first place. That's the Christian question. The Christian question is to bypass that whole deist idea and say, why should there be something of that kind? It's the existential question. That's the crucial question. And that's the question that contemporary physics, I mean, in the area of fine-tuning and all kinds of other issues, that's the issue that I think the physicist has to back off from, because the physicist works with a world that's already given. The world is there, and that's what physics is about. But if you allow the question to be asked, now, of course, physicists, some of them, Peter Atkins, for example, would not allow the question. But if you allow the question and don't disallow it, why should there be that world in the first place? Physics simply does not make any attempt, makes no claim to it, to answer that, or should not make any claim to answer that. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great note on which to finish.